The morning sun had just broken through the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the quiet roadside diner. Steam rose from coffee cups. The low rumble of engines filled the crisp air, and the smell of fuel, bacon, and leather hung around the Hells Angels bikers who had stopped for breakfast. They looked tough, the kind of men people crossed the street to avoid. But beneath those vests, they carried stories no one ever asked about. The laughter between them echoed against the chrome of their motorcycles until a piercing, desperate cry shattered everything. Everyone turned. A tiny figure in a red dress came running across the parking lot, her boots slipping slightly on the cold pavement, her messy light brown hair flying behind her. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, and her voice cracked with fear. "Please," she screamed, her arm outstretched, finger pointing back toward the road. "They're hurting my mama. Please, somebody help her." The group froze. The sound of her sobs was so raw that even the engines seemed to fall silent. A couple of truckers near the gas pumps turned their heads, but no one moved, except one man. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, in people who still step up when the world turns away, then please take a moment to like, comment, share, subscribe to because what happened next will restore your faith in humanity. The man who stepped forward was Mason Cole, a broad-shouldered biker in his late 30s, his jacket stitched with the red and white emblem of the Hells Angels. He'd seen a lot in life fights, betrayals, blood, but never a child like this. He dropped to one knee, steadying her trembling hands. "Where's your mama?" he asked softly, though his voice still carried that gravelly weight. The little girl could barely speak through her tears, but she pointed again down the two-lane road toward a cluster of old trailers half hidden by trees. "They're beating her," she sobbed. "Please help her." Without a second thought, Mason rose to his feet, his face hardening with purpose. "Tank rider with me," he said, motioning to two of his brothers. The three men swung their legs over their Harleys, engines roaring to life, tires screeching as they tore down the road. Dust and wind kicked up around the diner, leaving everyone in stunned silence. The little girl, still shaking, was taken inside by one of the other bikers, who wrapped her in a leather jacket to keep her warm. She sat by the window, eyes wide, watching as the red taillights disappeared in the distance. The road stretched quiet for almost 5 minutes. The diner crowd stood frozen, glancing out the window toward the long, empty highway. Then, faintly, a distant sound drifted back, and Grease shouting, a woman's cry, and the roar of engines cutting through violence. Mason and his crew had found the trailer, stood crooked and peeling at the edge of a muddy lot, surrounded by broken bottles and rusted cans. Inside, what they saw burned into their memories forever. Man, drunk and furious, had cornered a woman against the wall, his fists already bloodied, his voice slurred with rage. The small, cracked window let in a sliver of sunlight that fell across the terrified woman's face, bruised, swollen, and glistening with tears. Before he could strike again, the sound of boots hit the floorboards. Mason's voice was low, but dangerous. "That's enough." The man spun around, startled, bottle in hand. He barely had time to react before Mason grabbed his wrist mid-swing and twisted hard. The glass slipped, shattering on the floor. The other bikers were on him in seconds, pinning him down with the kind of controlled strength that comes from years of brotherhood and street fights. No words, just action. Mason muttered, holding the man's arm behind his back until he stopped struggling. Then he turned to the woman, his voice softening instantly. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked, still breathing hard. She nodded weakly, her lips trembling, tears spilling down her cheeks. My daughter. Is she safe?" "She's fine," Mason said, his tone gentler now. "She's at the diner. You're both safe now." Outside, the faint wail of police sirens began to echo through the trees. A neighbor must have called it in. The bikers didn't run. They didn't hide. They stood their ground in the yard, calm and silent, the dust settling around them. When the cops arrived, Mason and his brothers raised their hands without a word. The woman, her name was Carla, stepped forward, her voice shaky but determined. She told the officers everything. The man was her ex-boyfriend, freshly released from jail, who had tracked her down that morning to teach her a lesson. When the police led him away in handcuffs, Carla's shoulders finally dropped in relief. Mason quietly walked the little girl, Hannah, back to his motorcycle. He crouched down to her level and said softly, "You did good, kid. We're brave today." Hannah nodded, still clutching his sleeve. Her tiny fingers barely reached around the rough fabric of his leather jacket. They rode back to the diner together, the morning sun now rising high over the pines. Hannah sat on Mason's lap, holding a helmet far too big for her small head. The wind brushed her hair back as she looked up at the sky, her fear slowly melting into something else trust. By the time they returned, a small crowd had gathered. Truckers, travelers, locals all, waiting anxiously to see what had happened. When they saw Mason carrying the little girl unharmed, with her mother walking behind him, bruised but alive, every conversation stopped. The world seemed to go silent for a moment, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Carla's voice shook as she thanked the bikers over and over. "I didn't think anyone would come," she whispered. Mason looked at her for a long moment and simply said, "She made sure we did." He nodded toward Hannah, whose tear-streaked face now carried a faint hint of relief. The diner's owner came out with blankets and steaming mugs of coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he handed them over. Carla wrapped the blanket around Hannah, who burrowed into her mother's arms. The tension that had gripped everyone slowly began to fade, replaced by quiet admiration. One by one, the Hells Angels took off their jackets each, one heavy with patches, symbols, and years of road-worn stories, and draped them over the two. It wasn't just about warmth. It was a gesture of protection, respect, and solidarity. Even the police officers, who were still standing near their patrol cars, paused for a moment and looked away. There was nothing to say. Everyone there knew they had just witnessed something that went beyond reputation or stereotype. The patch on Mason's vest caught the sunlight as he leaned down to speak to Hannah. "You take care of your mama now, all right?" said. His gravelly voice softened with warmth. "You're her little guardian angel." The girl looked up at him, eyes wide, and nodded. Her tiny hand reached out and gripped the edge of his sleeve, as if she didn't want him to leave. Mason smiled faintly, then brushed a strand of hair from her face. News of what happened spread faster than anyone expected. By lunchtime, half the town had heard about the little girl in the red dress, who ran to the bikers and, how the hell? As Angels didn't hesitate for even a second. Strangers stopped by the diner just to shake their hands, to thank them for stepping in when others froze. Mason wasn't much of a talker. He'd lived most of his life behind a mask of toughness, but when someone asked him why they did it, he simply said, "You don't ignore a cry like that. Doesn't matter what patch you wear. Some things are just human." In the days that followed, Carla and Hannah began rebuilding their lives. The local community, moved by what had happened, stepped forward to help. People offered furniture, groceries, even a small apartment in town so they could have a fresh start. And every Sunday morning, familiar rumble would echo down Main Street, a line of Harley-Davidsons pulling up outside the diner. The same group of bikers would show up, bringing groceries, fixing things, or just sitting quietly with a cup of coffee and the sound of Hannah's laughter filling the room. The frost melted, the trees bloomed again, and the world seemed softer somehow. Hannah had started drawing again, flowers, birds, her mom smiling, and one morning, She came running into the diner clutching a sheet of paper. She stopped in front of Mason, who was sitting at the counter, sipping his black coffee as usual. "This is us," she said proudly, holding up her drawing. On the page, drawn in bright crayon colors, was a row of motorcycles, a little girl in red, and a man kneeling beside her, reaching out his hand. Mason stared at the picture for a long time. His rough, calloused fingers took it carefully, folding it with precision before tucking it inside his leather vest. "That's going with me wherever I ride," he said quietly. For a long moment, no one spoke. The diner was still except for the faint hum of the coffee machine and the low murmur of wind outside. Then Mason stood, gave Hannah a small salute, and walked out to his bike. The engines roared to life again, the sunlight flashing across chrome and leather as they rolled away down the open road. Inside, Hannah pressed her face to the window, watching until the red taillights disappeared around the bend. And though she couldn't hear it, Mason smiled as he rode his vest a little heavier now, not from the patches or the dust, but from the small folded drawing that reminded him of something simple, yet powerful. Sometimes the toughest hearts hide the deepest kindness. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to USA Kotha, Because in a world that often looks away, stories like this remind us that goodness still rides among us.